A sweltering night in July 1944, Barracks 12 in Compound 3 at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. The air hung heavy and still. Men snored, muttered in dreams, and sometimes shifted on metal frames that answered with thin, pained squeals. Peter Hoffman lay curled beneath a thin blanket, his left hand clamped a small pouch sewn from an old shirt, washed so often the cloth had faded almost white. A seam of weak light leaked from its mouth. Inside were a pencil stub and scraps of saved lunch wrapping, rough paper that swallowed graphite. With his right hand he wrote in strokes so small they were nearly invisible, moving only his fingers and listening for any change in breathing around him. He called it a diary only when he needed the comfort of the word. In truth, it was an autopsy, a private dissection of the camp's life and his own. He had begun to label the page's metamorphosis observation log. What he observed was the place, the men, and himself, a former middle school history teacher turned prisoner of war who could not stop watching. The habit that once served classrooms now served survival, and the line between the two felt dangerously thin. He wrote, July 17th or the 18th. Time here is of different substance. The men talked in the laundry about a coming show. Hans called it a circus. Eric joked about cowboys and Indians like the films he saw in Leipzig. Most laughed loudly as if ridicule were a duty. Klaus did not laugh. Klaus Becker did not laugh. Peter paused, then added what he had seen earlier that day. Klaus polishing an old pair of French boots with slow care, as if the act were sacred. Then Klaus's comment, delivered in a flat, certain voice. Indians belonged in Karl May novels and behind museum glass. If the Americans dragged them out to dance, that might be worth watching, the last breath of a dying people. The sentence chilled Peter more than the laughter. The premise carried authority because no one challenged it. Peter wrote, No one questioned the words dying people. Is that a truth or a habit we were taught? I record the question. A bunk groaned nearby. Sweat slid down Peter's temple, itchy as a crawling insect, but he did not dare lift a hand. He killed the light, held his breath, and waited until the barracks settled again. When it did, he hid the scraps in a crack beneath the bed slats. At dawn, the bugle tore the quiet apart, and he moved through washing and roll call with practiced plainness. In this place, anything unusual drew attention. Attention became danger. A man could be punished by guards, but he could also be punished by his own side, and that punishment arrived quietly, disguised as camaraderie, delivered in the dark. His work detail was the laundry. Roaring boilers, steam, and a sour mixture of soap powder, wet cloth, and sweat. The folding tables were the camp's best listening post. Martin, young and eager, leaned in while snapping a sheet. I heard the performers are soldiers, he murmured, native soldiers in U.S. uniforms. Hans, the thick-shouldered Bavarian, snorted. Propaganda. A few mixed bloods in costumes. Americans love theater. Eric, folding towels, glanced up. If it's true, then they are still here, and carrying rifles like us. A small silence formed, full of the hiss of pipes. Someone tried to laugh it away. Friedrich Weber, thin and slow-voiced, spoke without looking up. If it's true, then the concept of a dying people needs revision, and revising a concept means revising what it supports. A colder voice cut through. Your head is full of fog again. Klaus had stepped close without warning, holding an inspection list and a stack of garments marked for special handling. He was not an officer, yet he moved with the pressure of one. Rumor put him in the Waffen-SS. Whatever the truth, he held authority by fear and the remnants of discipline. We lost, Klaus said. We are locked in here. They can show us what they like. But how we look, what we remember, what we forget, that is our responsibility. He stopped beside Peter and watched his hands as Peter folded a uniform, then lifted his gaze to Peter's face. Especially you, Hoffman. A history teacher should know what counts as a fact worth remembering and what is only an entertaining episode. Peter kept his eyes on the cloth, aligning seams with careful precision. "I'm doing my work, Klaus." "Good," Klaus said, with something like a smile that did not reach his eyes. He patted Peter's shoulder with a measured touch. "Stay focused. Too much curiosity is a burden, especially now." All day Peter felt the mark of that touch, not pain, but the awareness of being placed on a list. He understood that he had entered Klaus's field of vision and that Klaus's attention worked like a probe, silent, patient, searching for weakness. Klaus did not need formal authority to make life hard. A raised eyebrow, a word in the right ear, and a man could find himself isolated, mocked, or set up for an accident that looked like ordinary roughness in a crowded barracks. A few days later, Peter went to the camp library, a small wooden building with thin shelves of pulp novels, old magazines, and practical manuals. The librarian was an American soldier named Jenkins, older, bespectacled, usually bent over a thick book at a table in the corner. The room smelled of dust and old paper. Peter moved along the shelves, slowly, pretending to browse while his heart raced. His English was limited, and he felt it in the shape of every title he could not quite decode. He was searching for anything about native peoples, anything that would let him test Klaus's certainty against something other than rumor or contempt. He nearly gave up when he spotted a dark green spine on the bottom shelf. The title was German, Peoples and Cultures of North America, an illustrated overview. He crouched and pulled it free, breath catching at German text and line drawings of shelters, tools, beadwork, and symbols. The drawings were not romantic. They were practical and specific, the kind of specificity that made museum glass feel like an insult. A calm voice said, "That one is in the wrong place." Peter looked up. Jenkins stood a few steps away with a rag in his hand, expression neutral. Peter snapped the book shut, holding it to his chest as if it were contraband. "I was only looking. It was right here." "It belongs on the geography and travel shelf, top row," Jenkins said. His eyes moved from the book to Peter. "You interested in that?" "I taught history," Peter said, hearing how thin it sounded. "Culture matters. It helps to know what is real and what is only a story." Jenkins nodded and walked to the shelf. There was a gap on the top row. He climbed onto a low stool, shifted books to make space, then held out a hand. Peter hesitated and gave him the green volume. Jenkins wiped the cover and spine carefully, as if the object deserved respect. Then, instead of placing it on the highest row, he slid it onto the middle shelf at an easy height. A small adjustment entirely defensible as routine. Jenkins patted the spine, climbed down, nodded once, and returned to his table. Peter stood still, staring at the book now within reach. No offer had been spoken, but the message felt clear enough. Jenkins had seen him searching and had lowered the barrier without leaving a footprint. In a camp built on rules and surveillance, even a minor act of discretion felt like a door opened a crack. It did not erase risk. It only suggested that risk was not the only force in the room. That night, under his blanket, Peter wrote. Jenkins's silence may be a language. The book moved from unreachable to reachable. A signal? Perhaps. The danger remains. Klaus's shadow is longer, but a seam in the rules exists. The days before the show carried restless energy wrapped in sarcasm. Men pretended not to care, yet everyone listened for details. They talked as if they were reviewing a film they had not yet seen, and the jokes were louder than usual, as if volume could hide curiosity. Klaus, oddly, did not mock. He told the barracks to watch closely and remember. Then we will discuss what is real vitality and what is arranged nostalgia. Peter heard a test in the words. Klaus intended to watch for proof, not for truth, and to punish whoever found themselves persuaded by what they saw. In August, in shimmering heat, the prisoners were marched to a leveled patch of sand near the camp edge. A low platform stood there, a few colored flags stuck in the ground. There were no seats. The POWs sat cross-legged on scorching earth. Guards formed a loose ring, their posture looser than at roll call, but their rifles still present. Peter chose a position toward the back with a clear view and hid a small slip of paper and his pencil stub in his trouser pocket. He tried to become a field observer. Sequence, clothing, movement, crowd response. If he could treat it as study, he told himself, then it would not be temptation. Then the drum began. It was low and dense, as if the beat rose through sand and bone into the chest. It did not feel like music at first. It felt like a second heartbeat, one that did not ask permission. Voices joined it, rough and high, without harmony, a force that braided with the pulse. Peter reached for meaning and found the attempt pointless. The vibration itself was the message, a physical declaration of presence. He realized his hand had stopped moving. The paper in his pocket stayed blank. Dancers stepped onto the platform. Feathers, beadwork, and leather fringe snapped and flared in the sun. The movement surged, then locked into brief stillness, disciplined power. Peter's prepared framework broke on the first beat. This was not a museum display, not a flat picture behind glass. It was a living practice carried in bodies and breath. He felt himself leaning forward, as if the distance between him and the platform were a problem he could solve by will. At the side of the platform stood several men in neat U.S. uniforms watching. They were not dressed as performers, and their stillness made the movement on stage sharper. One, especially young, stepped forward when the hosting officer began to speak. He repeated the officer's introduction in English, then turned and addressed the prisoners in German. "What you saw was a dance from the northern plains," he said, "a prayer for strength and courage." His German was simple and sometimes stiff but clear. The crowd stirred in a suppressed hum. For a moment the prisoners looked at one another as if checking whether they had heard correctly a native soldier in American uniform speaking their language. The officer introduced an elder, Mr. Wolkenstick. The young soldier translated and added that the elder's family had handed down the steps and songs for generations. Then he stepped back as if returning the center of the stage to the elder. The elder's face was weathered like stone. His regalia was plainer. He did not dance at once. His eyes traveled over the seated prisoners as if weighing them, not with hostility, but with a calm that made mockery feel childish. When he began, his movements were not large, yet each stamp and lifted hand carried control and authority that made the platform feel too small for him. It was less entertainment than reaffirmation. Peter had seen men perform for audiences. This felt like a man stating terms to the world quietly without raising his voice. The officer invited questions. Most prisoners dropped their eyes. To ask was to show interest, and interest could be read as weakness or seduction. Peter felt the damp paper in his pocket and felt something else, too. A question pressing against his ribs. If he remained silent now, he would be complicit in the same certainty Klaus had used like a club. Peter's hand rose before he could reconsider. Eyes snapped toward him. The officer blinked, then nodded. The young translator looked surprised for an instant, then focused. Peter stood. His legs were unsteady, but his voice steadied as he spoke in German. "My question is for Mr. Stick and for any soldier who can answer. We were taught histories and destinies of peoples. Some of what we believed feels incomplete after seeing living culture today. How have you kept these dances and songs, these things at the core of identity, through so many changes, even while wearing uniforms like any soldiers we know?" The young soldier translated into English. The elder listened without expression. A long pause settled over the sand, heavy and deliberate. Peter became aware of how exposed he was, upright among seated men, the single raised head in a field of lowered gazes. He did not look toward Klaus, but he felt Klaus's attention like heat on the back of his neck. Then the elder spoke in his own language, low and raspy. The young soldier turned back. He says, "Preserve? This is not something you put in a box. It is how we breathe, how we walk, how we look at the land and sky of our ancestors. War and uniforms are clothes, a season, but we are still here. The drum is still sounding. Wir sind immer noch hier, the young soldier repeated in German. We are still here. Then he added, quieter, as if speaking for himself. Before the war, I went to school. I learned German. Later, in the Army, it was useful. Language is a tool, like a rifle is a tool, but some things are not tools. The officer ended the questions with a practiced politeness and announced the close of the program. The prisoners were ordered to stand and march back. A silence rode the column, not fatigue and not obedience, but the dense silence of impact. No one spoke. Even coughing seemed too loud. Peter walked with a cold, almost painful excitement in his chest. The answer was not a tidy explanation, but it carried more force than any page he had taught from. He felt the old map of the world in his head tearing at its seams. Beside him, Friedrich's lips moved slightly, as if repeating a pattern. His fingers traced lightly along the seam of his trousers, like a man drawing a rhythm where no one could see. Ahead, Klaus's back was rigid. His steps struck the dirt harder than usual, as if he could grind the sound out of his memory by force. At the gate, Klaus slowed until he was briefly level with Peter. He did not look at him. "A fine question, teacher," he said in a voice low enough to feel like something slipped under the skin. "Very academic, very human. You gave them a perfect stage for their story of endurance. You deserve a medal from them." He paused. "Now everyone knows what interests you. Remember, the barracks are small and the nights are long." The threat was no longer implied. It was promised. That night Peter wrote by moonlight faster than he meant to, his pencil scraping in quick, dry bursts. "The drum is in my bones," he wrote. "We are still here. A nail through every careless claim of vanished or dying. Klaus's threat is real, but beneath fear I feel the collapse and rebuilding of my understanding. I cannot pretend I did not hear what I heard." Across from him, Friedrich lay awake, one hand extended from his blanket, and his index finger moved slowly over the concrete floor, drawing repeating curved lines. Not words, not a figure, but an attempt to capture motion and sound in shape. Peter watched, unsettled, symbols arriving where language could not hold the day. He understood suddenly that Friedrich was writing too, just without paper. Heavy footsteps crossed the barracks. Peter shoved his scraps away and lay still, breathing in the slow rhythm of sleep he did not feel. The steps paused near his bed for an instant, perhaps by chance, perhaps not, and then moved on. When they returned and faded, Peter understood he had written too freely. The diary could not stay under the bed slats. Klaus's attention had fixed on this corner. In the days that followed, the routine remained: labor, roll call, meals, but the air had changed. Men argued in brief whispers and stopped when Klaus passed. Someone murmured that the drum's rhythm was not primitive at all, and another answered that complexity proved nothing. A third asked too sharply what counted as life, if not the ability to endure and adapt. The arguments were short and cautious, but they existed, and that alone unsettled the barracks. The German book began to circulate in silence. Pages showed faint lines and folded corners, small marks of contact. Borrowers did not speak of it openly, but they passed it from hand to hand with the caution of contraband. Between Peter and Friedrich, a careful trust formed, not political and not martial, but academic. Friedrich would point with a fingertip at a symbol in a drawing, then glance at Peter as if asking, "Is this the same thing we saw?" Peter would answer with a nod or a single whispered word, careful not to let his voice carry. Klaus increased his patrols through the barracks. He no longer warned Peter directly. He watched. Others drifted away from Peter, eyes down, like men avoiding a contagious risk. Peter felt himself isolated and the shallows of danger rising. When he lay down at night, he began to consider not only hiding places but also exit strategies, where to stand if Klaus confronted him again, who might intervene, how far the guards were. One afternoon in the library, Jenkins returned a book with a folded slip tucked inside. Peter opened it in a corner. In neat English, with German beneath, it read, "Does true education begin with a sincere question mark, J?" Peter chewed the paper and swallowed, bitter and unmistakably a warning wrapped in encouragement. Jenkins had seen the question and the cost of asking it. The note felt like a hand on Peter's shoulder, firmer than Klaus's pat, and meant for a different kind of steadiness. About 10 days after the show, on a night as hot as breath, Klaus sat upright in the dark. His voice cut the barracks open. "I've had enough." Silence snapped into place. "Enough of the rot," Klaus said, "not the air, the thoughts. Some of you have been bewitched by feathers and strange cries. By day you pretend, by night you sneak. You forget who you are." He walked toward Peter and Friedrich, his steps distinct on concrete, and stopped at Peter's bed. "Peter Hoffmann, Friedrich Weber, bring out your little filthy toys, books, notes, drawings, all of it, for the barracks' cleanliness." It was a purge with a clean word as disguise. Peter stayed still, blood iced in his limbs. If he complied, he would surrender the only honest record he had, and he would be labeled before everyone. If he refused, Klaus would find another way, and the fight would become physical. In a barracks full of men, an injury could be explained as a stumble, a misunderstanding, a moment of temper. Peter understood that Klaus did not need witnesses who agreed with him. He only needed witnesses who looked away. Friedrich sat up, his slow voice sharpened. "What authority do you have to search personal property? Which regulation grants you that? The Americans' rules, or your self-appointed thought police?" Klaus answered coldly. "My authority is the duty to defend the spirit of the group. When worms eat through the hull, every man has the right to tear them out. Especially now we need unity and purity, not to be divided by an enemy's spectacle." "Enemy?" Friedrich said louder. "Who decided it was an enemy spectacle? You? Based on pamphlets you swallowed, or on fear of admitting you might be wrong?" "I saw living people expressing culture. Does that threaten you because it ruins your simple picture? Is your certainty so fragile that a drumbeat can break it?" The air tightened. Men held their breath. Peter knew Friedrich was placing himself between Peter and Klaus, buying time. In the darkness, Peter's fingers moved toward the crack beneath his bed, then stopped. If Klaus forced the issue now, the hiding place would be found. Peter's only advantage was that Klaus did not yet have a lawful excuse, and law still mattered in the camp in the narrow way it mattered to the guards. From the far end of the barracks, the representative, an older sergeant who handled small disputes, spoke with forced authority. "Enough, Klaus. Enough, Weber. The American guards patrol outside. Do you want trouble for all of us? Personal property is private unless the Americans order a search. Back to sleep." As if on cue, distant footsteps passed outside, a reminder of external power. Klaus hesitated, calculating. To push farther might draw attention from the guards and damage his position. To retreat would cost face. After a few suffocating seconds, he exhaled sharply. "Fine. Protect privacy. But keep your privacy from poisoning this barracks." He turned and went back to his bunk. The crisis had been delayed, not ended. Peter lay awake until morning with one decision hardening. The diary had to leave his hands. Destroying it would be safest, but it would also erase the only honest record of what had happened inside them. If it could not remain, it had to go outward, into a place where Klaus could not reach it and where Peter might someday speak without whispering. The next day, during a break in labor, Peter went to the library while it was empty. Jenkins looked up as Peter set the faded cloth pouch on the table. Peter's throat was dry. He forced himself to speak plainly. "I can't keep it," Peter said. "If it stays with me, it will be taken or destroyed. I ask you to destroy it." He made the request, but his eyes asked for the opposite. Jenkins slid his thick book aside and picked up the pouch. He untied it and withdrew the scraps, flipping through without reading, assessing only the paper and the writing's condition. The pages were small, mismatched, creased, softened by handling. Jenkins retied the pouch and held it for a moment as if weighing not just cloth but consequence. "Destroy it," Jenkins said in careful German. "If this were weapons, locations, or an escape plan, I would put it in the furnace. But it isn't. From the first day you searched for that green book to the question you asked at the program, I can guess what is inside. It is a record of minds changing under extreme conditions. Destroying that is a kind of wrongdoing." Peter could not answer. He had come ready to surrender the pages to safety, and now safety had turned into an accusation that to erase the record would be to cooperate with the same blindness that had threatened him. "I cannot keep it as an official file," Jenkins continued, voice-like procedure. "That would make trouble and may violate rules, but I can keep it privately, in secret, separate from camp routine until a day when it might serve understanding rather than only risk. If that day never comes, then it remains only protected paper, but it will not be lost because a loud man demanded it." He took a manila envelope, slipped the pouch inside, sealed it, and wrote on the front, "Camp Gruber, POW, Minsk. Notes, cultural observation, confidential, J." He locked the envelope into a small cabinet under the desk. The key hung on a cord under his uniform. "Remember," Jenkins said, "you never gave me anything. I never kept any prisoner's property. If anyone asks, you came here for books and nothing else. Do you understand?" Peter nodded, relief and disorientation mixing. The diary, the vessel of his fear and thought, was gone from his hand. His palm felt empty and suddenly lighter. He left the library with no proof of what he had done, and that absence was its own kind of protection. On May 8, 1945, the news finally pierced the wire and guard posts. It traveled first in soldiers' low talk and fragments of radio, then came officially through the camp loudspeaker, its voice rasping with electrical hiss. Germany's armed forces had surrendered unconditionally, and hostilities would cease. The prisoners stood on the parade ground in bright sun. No one cheered, no one wept. The war's end did not feel like release so much as a blank space opening under their feet. The empire that had demanded purity and certainty had ended in a sentence. What remained was a future without slogans and without a clear story to stand inside. For a moment the camp sounded wrong. The usual clatter of orders and shouts seemed to recede, leaving only wind and the distant mechanical buzz of the loudspeaker. Some men stared at the ground as if expecting it to open. Others stared at the guards, searching their faces for hints of what would happen next. A few whispered prayers, a few cursed under their breath. Klaus stood stiff and silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the fences. The posture that once organized fear in the barracks now looked like a man holding himself together by force, as if authority were a uniform he could no longer button. Peter felt no triumph in watching that. He felt only the weight of endings, the end of a war, the end of a story Klaus had used to control others, and the beginning of the harder work that followed when certainty collapses. Peter listened to words that had once been distant: surrender, unconditional, cease. His eyes drifted to the empty patch where the platform had stood. In that emptiness he felt the drum again, not as sound but as memory pressing in the body. One announcement declared the end of a world. Another, weeks earlier, had declared endurance. "We are still here." He searched for Friedrich and met his eyes across the crowd. Friedrich gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that they shared a private understanding beyond the loudspeaker's language. They did not smile. There was too much rubble in the words around them, but the nod meant you heard it too. You cannot unhear it. In the weeks that followed, labor decreased and movement increased. Repatriation rumors multiplied. 2 days before transport lists were expected, Peter went to the library one more time. "I came to say goodbye," he told Jenkins. Jenkins handed him a folded slip. "An address typed in English, the Minnesota Historical Society in Minnesota. Jenkins said he had lived in Minneapolis before the war and knew an archivist there. Not now, Jenkins said. It would be unsafe and improper to return what I keep. But remember this address. After you return to Germany and settle, if you decide it is right, you can write and ask whether a soldier named Jenkins ever mentioned storing cultural observation notes from a Camp Gruber prisoner. Provide details to prove it is yours. If everything aligns, the institution may contact me, and I may be able to transfer the envelope as a donation or research file. I can't promise, but I can leave a trail. Peter held the paper as if it were heavier than it was. The address was not a guarantee. It was an opening, narrow and cautious, toward turning private risk into public record. Why do this? Peter asked. For an enemy prisoner's thoughts? Jenkins removed his glasses, wiped the lenses, and put them back on. I am not doing it for you, he said. I manage a library. Books exist to be read and to carry questions. The question you asked that day was a real question. A real question deserves the attempt to answer it to be preserved. Whether it becomes dust or helps someone in the future, I cannot control. Preserving the possibility is part of my work. Peter folded the address and placed it inside his shirt. Thank you, he said, for preserving the possibility. Spring 1995, Hanover, Germany. Peter Hoffman, now in his 70s, sat at a small table across from a young scholar. A recorder's red light glowed between them as they spoke about post-war Germany and American influence. The conversation drifted carefully to Oklahoma. There was a cultural program in the camp, the scholar asked. Yes, Peter said. Native dancing, drums. What was it for you then? Curiosity. It was an earthquake, Peter said. We thought we understood the world's tracks. Then we saw what we were told had vanished standing in front of us, alive, even in uniform, declaring existence with sound and movement and with one sentence. What sentence? Peter said it in German clearly. Wir sind immer noch hier. We are still here. He told her he had begun to write secretly, recording the camp's reactions and his own disorientation, and that the pages became dangerous. I entrusted them to an American administrator, he said. I never knew their final fate, but I recorded what happened, and he believed the attempt to understand was worth keeping alive as a possibility. The scholar asked what it changed in him, and Peter answered without drama. It changed his sense of what endurance looked like. It changed his sense of what propaganda had stolen from him, not only facts, but the habit of seeing other people as objects in a story that ended when the story said so. After the war, he said, we had to rebuild more than cities. We had to rebuild how we think when the old narratives collapse. For me, that drumbeat became a reference point. Not a lesson about America, but a lesson about being wrong and about the dignity of continuing anyway. Sometime in the late 1990s in St. Paul, Minnesota, an archivist processed a box of ordinary materials from a deceased veteran's estate. At the bottom was an old envelope labeled in fading pencil, Camp Gruber, POW Missy, Notes, Cultural Observation, Confidential, J. Inside was a handmade cloth pouch, brittle with age, and inside that a stack of mismatched slips covered in German. The dates ran from summer 1944 into spring 1945. The pages held no military secrets. They held a prisoner's close observations of camp life and of one cultural program that had cracked open his inherited certainties. The handwriting shifted from careful lines to hurried scratches, as if danger had sometimes been close enough to tighten the wrist. On the last page, on smoother paper, a steadier hand had added a note. This record began in fear and confusion and took shape in silent questioning. It was treated as a betrayal of internal purity. In the end, I understood it recorded not collapse, but the beginning of rebuilding, the rebuilding of a single mind and perhaps a small foundation for broader understanding. The drums did not stop. PH Addendum 1971. Following procedure, the archivist created a catalog entry noting source dates, language, and a summary, and filed it under World War II prisoner experience, personal narratives, cross-cultural encounter. The envelope disappeared into the architecture of shelves and numbers. It would not be famous. It might never be requested. But it had arrived where Jenkins said it belonged, preserved as a possibility.